Hello and welcome to the Crystal Palace podcast. I'm Alfonso Greenborough, and in today's podcast I'll be looking over the game against West Ham by bringing you my match review, player rankings and my man of the match. As well as this, I'm also going to bring you interviews with Roy Hodgson and Jeffrey Slopp after the game. So let's begin. Despite taking the lead within 6 minutes, Crystal Palace lost a thoroughly well fought battle at London Stadium after a West Ham comeback stole the 3 points thanks to a smash and grab 17-minute spell. The game opened well for both sides, and the hosts found themselves squandering a strong early chance as Javier Hernandez fired into the ever approaching legs of Wayne Hennessy within 4 minutes. Palace's Max Meyer and Wilfried Zaha were then frustrated to break into the Hammers box but not find anyone in yellow with their crosses. It was a more unlikely goalscorer in James McArthur who opened the Eagles' account just minutes later, however, as he raced into United's box to prod a James Tompkins header underneath the oncoming home keeper Lucas Fabianski. With the Eagles having taken an early lead, Palace began to sit back and the game settled down to a more typical opening rhythm, and Roy Hodgson's back four defended with resilience as West Ham launched a series of responding attacks. Pablo Zabaleta in particular kept the Eagles on their toes as he stormed frequently along their left wing. Lucas Perez was perhaps the closest to hitting the back of Palace's net in the opening exchanges when he latched onto a dropping ball in the Eagles' box, only to volley wide from 15 yards. Barely 5 minutes later, much to the approval of the energised home crowd, Perez then only had Mamadou Sakho to blame for his low-jawed cross not finding a man in claret and blue just yards from Hennessy's goal line when the Frenchman stood strong to send the ball ricocheting into touch. At the other end of the pitch, Zaha found his trademark nullified by a sea of West Ham legs before Aaron Wan-Bissaka roamed forward to see a probing cross well cleared by the home defence. The Hammers swiftly resumed their bombardment of crosses, but Welshman Hennessy and his four-man defensive guard ensured that the score remained 0-1. Declan Rice attempted a different path to goal, but his towering central header from the penalty spot sailed wide in the 38th minute. The first half then finished in dramatic fashion as Luka Milivojevic struck West Ham's crossbar from a long-distance free kick with less than a minute of time remaining. But the drama didn't cease following the half-time break as Robert Snodgrass opened the home side's account by volleying the ball from the edge of the Palace box just inches lower than Milivojevic had managed 15 minutes earlier. Snodgrass's strike blew the game wide open and, as the chilled East London atmosphere grew, so did the energy of the match. Zabaleta attempted to double the Hammers' lead when he rifled an effort at goal, but again Sakho got his body in the way and sent the ball spiralling out for a West Ham corner, which was dealt with by the Eagles after Pachavalana was forced to leave the field with a knock. Attacking towards the vocal visiting Palace fans, Zaha threaded the ball through to Meyer, but the German midfielder was crowded out in the box before, moments later, having a point-blank range effort blocked by Fabianski as the ball cannoned into the area from McArthur's boot. It would be the hosts who were celebrating next though, after Hennessy saved well from a Robert Snodgrass free kick, only to see Hernandez react fastest to the loose ball and strike high into the Eagles' net. West Ham's lead was then extended in remarkable fashion when Felipe Anderson curled a ball from the right edge of Palace's box beyond the reach of Hennessy to make the score 3-1. The Irons almost added a fourth when goalscorer Hernandez couldn't capitalise on an Arthur Masuaku cross and put the ball wide from close range. However, Palace recollected themselves in time to net the game's fifth goal via Jeffrey Slopp. The second-half substitute bagged his second of the season with 50 minutes of the game remaining when he headed home firmly from the penalty spot to bring his side back into the game. Zaha and Andros Townsend both saw tame chances result in nothing before Garnay sent the ball into Hennessy, who deflected it over to safety. The following 10 minutes became a tense affair and Palace fought hard to find the game's equaliser, but frustratingly their efforts were in vain. Referee Anthony Taylor blew his whistle for full time to confirm that West Ham had done enough to keep the 3 points in East London, much to the Eagles' disappointment. So I'm now going to move on to the player ratings, but before I start, don't forget you can follow us on both Twitter and Facebook at Crystal Palace for all the latest Palace news. And also, if you are on Facebook, do feel free to join our Facebook group which is a really great place to join me discussions and also share your opinions with other fans. And if you are someone like myself who does like to go onto forums, not only to read what others are saying, but also to post your own opinion on there, then of course I'd also recommend you do join the Facebook group alongside your other forums that you may be members of. Now likewise, if you are someone who wants to keep up to date with all the latest Palace news, whether that be interviews, whether that be transfers, or whether that be just our general sort of opinion of the game or things that are happening at the club, you know, what our thoughts are as a page, then of course do follow us, just to give you another sort of Palace account to follow on both our Twitter and Facebook pages at @crystalpalace. And like I've said, you know, much like the Facebook group, if you ever do want to get in contact with us, or you want to have discussions, or you basically just want to share your opinion with us, then of course you could do it, you know, through our Facebook and Twitter pages. Now if you are someone who's listening to the podcast on YouTube, then that gives you obviously a great place for you to share your opinion. So if you are listening on YouTube, then do feel free to comment below with your player ratings, where you rate the players' performances from 1 to 10, with obviously 10 being the best. Now even if you don't want to do that, and even if you know you don't want to really rate the players, then just comment below with your views of the game, your general views of the game. You know, whether you're a West Ham fan or whether you're a Palace fan, do comment below what you thought about the game. You know, how good were the goals West Ham scored? How bad was our defending, and the fact that we gave them too much space on the edge of the area, and just talk about the fact that, you know, or I suppose you could discuss from a Palace perspective, how our defending's gone from being great and being, you know, statistically one of the best outside the top 6 to being one of the worst. So obviously there's quite a few talking points there. So if you are someone who has different views or wants to share your opinion, then of course you can do that in the YouTube comments. And one of the main reasons for that is, of course, I have my opinion, which I'm sharing to you in the podcast, but what I want to do, I want to come back to the video and just read the comment section and basically see what other fans thought about the game, whether they be West Ham or Palace fans, basically so I can get a more broader view of the game as well, but also any other fans who come to the video, whether they be West Ham or Palace fans. Not only will they listen to my views in the podcast, but they can actually read the comment section as well, and basically just get a more sort of broader view or you know, of the game itself. And especially if you do your player ratings, you know, you can compare how you rated the players to how I rated it, and basically, you know, we can have a sort of discussion and sort of a comparison there. Now obviously if you do want to follow any of the social media pages that I've mentioned, or join the Facebook group, then obviously check all the links that will be in the description below. But we're now going to move on to the player ratings. I'm going to start in goal with Wayne Hennessy, who I'm going to give a 5 overall. So Wayne Hennessy has been one of our most consistent players this season, and is certainly up there to be one of our sort of top 3 players if he carries on with the form he's at in the minute. And certainly I do think he does deserve the praise, because he's obviously, like I've said, been one of our most consistent players. But what I have noticed is actually in the last sort of few games or so, especially the last sort of 3, his standards have dropped slightly. Now that's not to say he's necessarily been performing bad, but as was the case against West Ham here, it was another sort of under par performance, and for that reason I gave him the 5 overall. Now in terms of the first half, obviously we scored an only goal through MacArthur, so of course West Ham quite early on in the game were under quite a lot of pressure to get back into it, and of course you'd expect them to put loads of crosses, loads of balls into the box, basically trying to sort of find any avenues to get back into the game. Now even though that was the case, I do think Hennessy was rarely troubled for that opening 45 minutes, and realistically you're going to be looking at his first half performance going, actually, other than a really good save from Javier Hernandez, obviously where he made himself big and made the save there, Hennessy didn't necessarily have to do much in the game. So in the first half you're probably looking at a 6 overall for his performance. But where his performance does change, and this is the thing where, even though he's been so consistent this season, this is where he's sort of, the standards dropped a little bit, it's just in the second half where he obviously conceded the 3 goals. Now of course, you know, Robert Snodgrass's goal, which was the first one, you know, that was a great goal. You know, he's obviously run down that right hand side, cut inside and had a shot. You know, some people may say Hennessy should be doing better there, but realistically it's such a good goal from Robert Snodgrass, I can't really blame anyone there. And if anything, if you're going to blame the goalkeeper, it's not really fair when you consider that actually the defence and the midfield actually let Snodgrass have too much space on the edge of the area. So in terms of the first goal, obviously it's not great conceding a goal like that, but I don't really think the fault is with Hennessy in that occasion. But the second one, however, you know, obviously Anderson, who was obviously fantastic in this game, he's obviously taken a free kick a few minutes after Snodgrass has scored his goal, and Hennessy's made a fantastic save, you know, got down low, parried away Anderson's free kick, but rather than putting it away for a player to clear or putting it out for a corner, he's put it straight into the path of Javier Hernandez, and that's the easiest goal probably Javier Hernandez will score. So in terms of the first goal, no fault there because it was a great goal, but the second one, it started with a great save from Hennessy, you know, from that free kick. You know, we've seen people like Payet in the past score free kicks from that sort of distance, so it was actually nice to see Hennessy get down low and make the save, but the fact that he parried the ball right to Javier Hernandez to make it so easy for him to score. That was of course very disappointing. Now obviously the third goal as well, it's obviously not great for any goalkeeper to concede 3 goals, but the third goal, much like the first goal, was once again a goal of real quality. Anderson, rather than obviously cutting inside from the right hand side, which Snodgrass did, he's obviously cut in from the opposite flank on that left hand side and absolutely curled one into that top right hand corner. So realistically for me, both the first goal and the third goal, I can't really put too much blame on Hennessy there, mainly because of just the sheer quality of the goals. But then some people could argue, and I certainly do see it in aspects, in the fact that with Snodgrass's one, maybe Hennessy should have, he got obviously his position right. He obviously got across his goal line, but couldn't quite get to the ball. And the same could be said for the third goal. So maybe, even though I don't really want to criticise Hennessy for it, because I don't necessarily think it was his fault. I think it's players' fault in the midfield and the defence for giving the player like Anderson and Snodgrass too much space on the edge of the area. But like I've said already, maybe Hennessy could have done a little bit better to try and at least reach the balls when they were going into the top corner. But like I've said already, no real chance with either of them first 2 goals. But the main thing really for me that was disappointing is the fact that, he parried the free kick, or Anderson's free kick, right into the path of Hernandez, which made it so easy for him to score. And when you consider Hernandez in the Premier League, I think all of his goals have been scored within the box. Really just goes to show that a player of his quality and someone who's renowned for being a poacher in front of goal, you really shouldn't be giving him easy chances like that. So like I've said already, Hennessy in the first half didn't really have too much to do, but he obviously made a good save from Javier Hernandez. But the main reason, even though he's been so consistent this season, the main reason his performance dropped is A, because he conceded 3 goals, but B, mainly because of the second goal in particular, where of course he made the error. But like I said already, I can't really blame him for the first or the third goals, because he really had no chance there. But Hennessy, like I've said, last sort of few games or so, especially last sort of 3 or so, his standards have dropped slightly. So hopefully, we've got this week now where you can obviously rest up. Hopefully coming into the Leicester game, which is a really massive game, hopefully he can carry on his form from before these last sort of 3 games or so. Because like I've said, he was up there as one of our players of the season, so hopefully he can go back to that form, because certainly we're going to need him. He's going to be crucial in the game against Leicester. But Wayne Hennessy here, I think a 5 is a fair result. So I'm going to move on now to the defence, and I'm going to start off with Aaron Wan-Bissaka at the right back, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now of course Felipe Anderson, like I've said already, he obviously scored a fantastic goal, and obviously got the assist with the other goal with that obviously mistake from Hennessy from the free kick. So of course he was causing threats throughout the game, and the man that was tasked with dealing with him was Aaron Wan-Bissaka. Now before I go on to talk about the performance as a whole, I just want to talk about some West Ham fans. Now they're obviously putting on stuff on Twitter, with a video of Wan-Bissaka getting absolutely, destroyed by Anderson. Literally, it's just a nutmeg. That's like the only time Anderson got past, or got the ball past Wan-Bissaka really easily. And they're putting it out there going, oh, this is meant to be, one of the best right backs. You say he's one of the best young players, yet Anderson got past him so easily. Now what I've got to say to that is actually that was only one chance throughout the game. If you look back at it, I think it was a very good battle. It was a good attacker versus a good defender, and I do think that yes, Anderson got past him on a few occasions, but the majority of the time I think Wan-Bissaka dealt with him really well. So obviously West Ham fans are going to say that Anderson destroyed him and the fact that he nutmegged him. But actually, if you look at it as a whole, I do think he done a relatively good job at dealing with him. And, when you consider once again his inexperience, the fact that, he's playing against tough opponents, the fact that he deals with them so well is obviously credit to him. And like I've said already, even though Anderson proved a challenge, the fact that Wan-Bissaka still came through the game, having won a fair amount of challenges and duels, that was of course good to see him as well. But I do think that, going back to what I've said with Wan-Bissaka's performance, I do want to move away from his defensive side, because that's something that's very consistent and he always does that perfectly. But moving on to the offensive side of his game, because that's something that I've said has improved quite a lot in recent games, and certainly we didn't quite see that in this game here against West Ham. Now obviously, like I've said, over the last sort of few weeks or so, I've been praising Wan-Bissaka, saying yes, he's carrying on doing his good defensive work, but he's now starting to venture forward. But in this game here against West Ham, whether it be the fact that we had to sit back and sort of ride the attacking storms of West Ham, or whether it's just the fact that he didn't necessarily feel this comfortable in this game going forward, whatever it was, we didn't necessarily see him being much of a threat going forward. And certainly after half time, that was most evident. We're You know, we're 1-0 up. We want to try and get that second goal, which we ultimately did, but it was at a different point in the game. If we got that goal to make it 2-0 because of someone like Wan-Bissaka maybe just proving to be a threat down the flank, maybe it would have been a different scenario, because I do think, you know, it's quite a dodgy lead, leading 1-0, so maybe it would have been better to see someone like Wan-Bissaka just contribute a bit more offensively, because like I've said, a 1-goal lead is quite nervy, and it would have been nice to secure it. Now, ultimately we didn't, but once again, obviously there's lessons to be learned there. But once again, Aaron Wan-Bissaka here playing at right back, not necessarily his best game defensively, but still dealt with Felipe Anderson relatively well. And, you know, the reason I've given him a 6 as opposed to a 7 is just the fact that he didn't necessarily prove to be a threat that much going forward, and that was obviously most notable in the second half, where we obviously were trying to get back into the game. But Aaron Wan-Bissaka here, another good defensive performance from him, but it would have been nice to see a bit more in his attacking play. So I'm going to move on now to the first of our 2 centre-backs, and that is of course James Tompkins. Now, I'm going to give him a 5 overall, because much like the games have been recently, you know, much like Hennessy, you know, he's been very consistent this season, but the last few games or so his standards have dropped slightly. Now, whether it was just the fact that he was going back to play his old side and maybe that was playing on him, or whether it's just the fact that he's just in a you know, a bad spell of form, whatever it was a very disappointing performance from him, and once again I'm going to give him a 5. Now, in terms of, you know, chances he had throughout the game, you know, I talked about MacArthur's goal being so early on in the game and putting pressure on West Ham. One of the main reasons MacArthur did score that goal is because of the fantastic flick that James Tompkins gave to him. Now, of course, you know, our free kick deliveries haven't been great this season, but that ball by Patrick Vanana was absolutely pin perfect onto the head of James Tompkins, who of course headed it down into MacArthur's path. And not only did he head it into his path, but he positioned it just right so that MacArthur could get a foot to it, but also can get it under the goalkeeper. So not only was the goal itself good, and the fact that MacArthur took it well, but the assist to get the ball to MacArthur in the first place was really good. So in terms of James Tompkins' performance, it started really well. You know, 6 minutes in, he had already got an assist against his former club, so that was all great. But actually, as the game sort of wore on, it was quite evident to me, and it did really show. It's the fact that he just really struggled up against someone like Andy Carroll in particular when he came on in the second half. So not only did he struggle with people like Felipe Anderson, but actually in the second half, when West Ham brought on their substitutes, Andy Carroll in particular, you know, that seemed to be quite a difficult player to deal with for James Tompkins. Now, I've talked about recently, you know, the fact that James Tompkins' standards have dropped a little bit, and, you know, especially against Brighton, where he was absolutely abysmal. At the moment, he's obviously going through a bad spell, and he is absolutely far from his best, but he isn't necessarily terrible. You know, the Brighton game, he was absolutely terrible, but here against West Ham, we saw some good spells, like the assist he got, and like sort of the beginning of the first half. But like I've said, when West Ham brought on people like Andy Carroll, and when people like Felipe Anderson really did get into the game, it really did show that actually Tompkins did struggle. But like I've said, he is obviously far from his best, but it wasn't necessarily a terrible performance. And I do think a 5 really does reflect that, because in parts of the game he was good, but in other parts he was obviously subpar. So I do think a 5 overall is a fair reflection. And, you know, you're looking back at the goals we conceded. Yes, they weren't necessarily directly involved with James Tompkins in terms of errors leading to goals, but maybe he could have done a better job, as could the whole defence and the defensive midfielders, in just closing down players. Because you look back at Snodgrass's goal, and if he had been closed down much quicker, or if he had been tackled, that he doesn't have that chance to shoot on the edge of the area, and the same could go for Felipe Anderson. So maybe that's something that the defence have got to look at. But obviously, even though James Tompkins' performance was obviously not great, and I've obviously given him a 5, I do think it was obviously significantly better than the Brighton game, because obviously that wasn't great. So hopefully going forward, he can go back to his old self. And, you know, like I've said, the Leicester game at the weekend is so important, so we need players like Tompkins, like Saka, like Hennessy to come back to their old selves, because it obviously is a really important game, and they're obviously key players for us. But James Tompkins here, another disappointing performance from him. Not necessarily terrible, not necessarily best. I do think a 5 is a fair reflection. I'm going to move on now to his centre-back partner, and that is of course Mamadou Sakho, who I'm going to give a 5 as well overall. Now, much like what I said with Tompkins, in the fact that he hasn't necessarily been playing great, I do think that's sort of the same sort of similar thing for Sakho here, in the fact that he wasn't necessarily great in terms of his usual self, in terms of, you know, being that rock at the back and making it really difficult for the opposition. But I don't necessarily think he was absolutely terrible as well. Now, in terms of Javier Hernandez, obviously that was the main guy that Sakho was obviously, you know, tasked with dealing with. And I do think, you know, throughout the first half, he done a really great job just to restrict the striker, making sure that Hernandez didn't really have any chances on goal. And when you consider the only chance that Hernandez had, or any real chance he had, Hennessy saved it, really just goes to show how well Sakho done in terms of, you know, dealing with the threat of Hernandez. So in that respect, I think he had a very good performance. And in terms of another player, you know, when Andy Carroll came on, yes, Tompkins failed to deal with him, and he obviously failed found him quite difficult to deal with. But Saka, on the other hand, much like what he done with Hernandez, he dealt with Andy Carroll so well and done a much better job than Tompkins did in terms of just restricting his chances and basically making it difficult for Carroll, because, you know, we've seen before when Carroll scored an absolute wonder goal against us. So the fact that we were able to deal with him and actually stop him obviously scoring against us, but obviously also actually getting into an area so he can actually put on chances for teammates as well. The fact that we've done that was great. But like I've said, you know, even though Saka done relatively well in certain aspects of his play, especially his ball playing out from the back, you know, you look at the stats, and I think it's one of the stat websites has picked it out and said, you know, Saka's played the most passes, or, you know, he was involved in the most duels or something like that in terms of any Premier League player in a game this season. So the fact that he's getting involved in terms of taking the ball from the defence and driving forward, that's great. But maybe he needs to just concentrate a little bit more, because he's sort of dipped at the moment. Just concentrate a little bit more on his defending, because like, we obviously know how good he is defensively, but at the moment he's just sort of showing the skills he's got with the ball playing ability. So maybe if he just, you know, takes a step back, let's say, and just concentrate on his defending and get that back to the standard he has been sort of before the last sort of 3 games or so, that would be great. Because like what I said with Tompkins, you know, Sacco, Tompkins and, you know, Wayne Hennessy as well, you know, they've been fairly consistent this season, but they've dropped in the last few games. And when you consider we've got a big game against Leicester at the weekend, we really need our best players to be up to standard. And I certainly do think here, you know, I do think Sacco, the main reason I've given him a 5 is the fact that he was fairly competent defensively and playing the ball out from the back. But obviously the fact that he had a few sort of mishaps and a few moments where he was a bit edgy on the ball, that's of course the thing that's quite worrying. So hopefully he can get back to his normal self. And I certainly do believe, having seen the quality he's got, you know, got on the ball as well as defensively, as well as the fact that he's actually just got that charisma and he's got that sort of attitude just to, you know, pick himself up and improve. Hopefully that he'll have that sort of attitude going into the game, because even though this performance was subpar, I do certainly think the best is still to come from him. So hopefully Sacco, you know, for the game at the weekend against Leicester, he can obviously improve his performance. So I'm going to move on now to the final player in our defence, and that is of course the left back Patrick Vallano, who I'm also going to give a 5. Now before I go on to talk about his performance, you know, you've got to look at the whole defence as a whole and look at the theme. You know, I've given Patrick Vallano a 5, I've given Mamadou Sakho a 5, I've also given James Tompkins a 5, which really just does reflect how sort of lacklustre we were in the game defensively. Now that's not to say we necessarily were terrible, because I do think at times our structure was quite good and we defended relatively well in that first half against West Ham, but in the second half, you know, we were giving players too much space and we basically were sitting so far deep that we were inviting West Ham to attack us. That was one of the reasons why we conceded them 3 goals, in the fact that we were just sitting back, we were happy with the 1-0, and ultimately we ended up chasing the game because of that. So overall, you know, like I said, before I go on to talk about Vallano's individual performance, just got to highlight the fact that actually the defence, even though they weren't necessarily terrible, they were obviously subpar, and one of the reasons why we went on to lose the game is mainly the fact that obviously the defence weren't quite up to it and they weren't obviously dealing with the threats like they normally would. But in terms of Vallano's performance, like I've said, I've given him a 5 overall. Now obviously I talked about McArthur's goal and the fact that Tompkins made a fantastic flick on, and of course I'll go on to talk about McArthur's technique later on. But obviously Patrick Vallano, who doesn't normally take free kicks from that distance, but he took the free kick on that occasion. Lovely whip ball into Tompkins, perfect position, and made it very easy for Tompkins to head it onto McArthur. So not only did Vallano actually get involved in terms of, you know, doing what he normally does, but also he was getting involved in set pieces as well. So it's good to see him adding to his game. And like I said, you know, he doesn't normally take the free kick, so the fact that he took it upon himself to deliver that ball into the area so accurately as well, that was of course great to see. And, you know, when you consider how far it was out, normally, considering we've been quite bad at set pieces this season, I weren't really expecting much from it. But the fact that he actually delivered, or his delivery was as good as it was, that was of course great to see. Now, of course, Zabaleta and Vallano, that was quite an interesting battle throughout the game. Obviously, Zabaleta playing on West Ham's right, and obviously Vallano on our left. And certainly that was quite a big challenge, because both of them fullbacks are quite attacking. So, of course, that was a challenge throughout the game. And like Tompkins had to deal with Hernandez, obviously Vallano was challenged and tasked with dealing with Zabaleta. And certainly he did seem to do relatively well. But obviously they both went into a challenge on each other, and Van Aanholt seemed to come out the worst of it, you know, seemed to hurt his shoulder. And even though he did carry on for the first half, he played about 5 minutes into the second half, and you know, he got another knock again, and he obviously couldn't carry on, and obviously he didn't seem to recover over that half-time period. And of course he was taken off quite early on into that second half. Now, of course, that was quite disappointing, because I do think Van Aanholt was one of our better players. You know, yes, he wasn't great, but certainly the fact that he was dealing with Zabaleta so well, I do think he was good in that respect. And of course, it was disappointing to see him go off the pitch, considering, you know, what he's got to offer. And even though he may not have been that attacking in the game, it could just be one moment where he makes a sprint and he could have created a chance for us. But unluckily for us, we couldn't quite see that. And, you know, going back to the injury, hopefully it isn't too serious, because like I've said, he's a very important player for the team. And even though he's had a slight dip in form in the last few games, I'm sure he'll pick himself up and, get back to the stand he were before. But like I've said, it was obviously disappointing to see him go off. But the player who came on for him in Jeffrey Schlupp, he went on to score our second goal as well. So even though it's a negative in the fact that he got injured, and fingers crossed and touch wood that it isn't, you know, a really harsh injury, it wasn't really a serious injury. But like I said, you know, the fact that Jeffrey Schlupp came on and he hasn't been great this season, the fact that he came on and made a difference, albeit not helping us to win the game, but getting us back into the game, that was of course great to see. But overall, Patrick Van Aanholt playing at left back, I think he done a relatively good job in terms of his attacking play, in terms of, you know, whipping in that free kick for us to score our first goal from. Obviously, he had a very good challenge up against Zabaleta, which ultimately he came off worse on, in the fact that he had to come off with an injury. But I do think overall, looking at the time he was on the pitch, I think both his defensive and defensive work were relatively good. But I do think a 5 really is a fair reflection of what was a slightly disappointing performance from the left back. So I'm now going to move on to the midfield, and I'm going to start with the goal scorer, James McArthur, who I'm going to give a 7 overall. Now, obviously, some of you may be a bit surprised in the fact that it wasn't necessarily the best performance from us, and some may say even lacklustre from us, but I do certainly think the fact that McArthur got our first goal in the game, whilst also being fairly effective in midfield, I do think a 7 overall is a fairly reflective, really reflective of his performance in the game. Now, like I've said already, you know, in terms of the opening goal, I talked about Van Aanholt's delivery, which was obviously good. I talked about the delivery getting to Tompkins, who obviously headed it into McArthur's path. So, of course, them two players who were firstly involved, obviously their contribution was good as well. But I do think the finish as well from McArthur needs to be given a bit of recognition as well, because obviously it's quite a difficult one where you're so close to the goalkeeper, but the fact that he got on the end of James Tompkins' header down and obviously was able to control it and put it under Fabianski at that quite close distance and time everything right and power everything right, the fact that he was able to do that so well is obviously, you know, you've got to give him credit there. And when you consider now that's his second goal in about 3 games or so, you know, I said after the Burnley game that maybe that was his turning point in the season, and certainly the fact that he's now playing slightly further up the pitch and being a little bit more effective offensively by getting a few goals certainly does show to me that he's slowly starting to improve. And, you know, I talked a few weeks ago in the fact that maybe the fact that Roy Hodgson has now changed our formation a bit to be a sort of 4-2-2-2, in the fact that Meyer and McArthur play quite narrow, that seems to have helped McArthur in particular, and certainly it was quite reflective in his game against West Ham, not only because he obviously scored our goal by getting into that attacking area, but actually in the midfield he was effective in that role. Now, of course, he's always quite busy in the midfield and he always does a shift in there, but I do think when you consider West Ham were a lot better than us on the day, the fact that McArthur done his job so well in terms of making it life difficult for West Ham, albeit they eventually won the game, but making life difficult for them in terms of, you know, doing his defensive work, whilst also going forward to get on the end of chances like the goal he scored, whilst also just being sort of a pest basically for that West Ham back four by, you know, proving to be one of our better attacking threats. That was of course great to see as well. And the thing I really like about it is that, yes, we always know that he puts in, you know, 100% for the team and always gives his all, but the fact that he does it without any fuss as well, the fact that he just gets on with it, you know, doesn't let the occasion get to him and just does his shift in the midfield, that was of course great to see as well. Now, one thing I was surprised to see is that towards the end of the game we got subbed off for Jordan Ayew. Now, I'm not sure whether that's just a tactical change just to give us another attacking player, but if I was Roy Hodgson, I would have kept McArthur on the pitch, mainly because of his attacking threat, but also because he didn't really do anything wrong in the game and he was one of our better players. So for me personally, would have liked to see McArthur stayed on for more of the game. Maybe he was a bit fatigued and that's why he got taken off, but when you consider he got our first goal in the game, and I think, you know, we had already scored our second by then, but even so, you've got one of our attacking players who's scored a goal in the game already. I don't really see the reason why you would take him off, considering obviously, like the goal he took, he's obviously quite good in them attacking positions. But overall, I do think McArthur does deserve the 7, not only the fact that he scored our opening goal, which was, like I said, great technique to get it under the goalkeeper, but the fact that he just contributed in the midfield both defensively and offensively, and basically done it with 100% work rate and without any fuss at all, that's the thing that really did impress me. Now, of course, I was disappointed to see him subbed off in the second half, but I do think the time he was on the pitch, he does obviously deserve the 7 I've given him. So I'm going to move on now to one of his midfield partners, and that is Cheku Kouyaté, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. And much like what I said with Tompkins, this was another player returning to his old club, and I don't necessarily think it affected him as much as, it probably did affect James Tompkins, but certainly Cheku Kouyaté didn't have one of his better performances, but certainly was better than especially the defensive players in the game overall. Now, a word I've used quite a lot to describe Kouyaté's performances in the past is battling, in the fact that he's always putting himself about a bit, always doing, both defensive and offensive work, and just being, just using his physicality to be basically a beast in the game, and basically, make it difficult for the opposition. So we've done exactly that here against West Ham, and albeit it weren't necessarily the most effective when you look back at the goals we conceded, he probably should have done a better job in terms of protecting the back four and not giving people like Snodgrass and Anderson the space to get on and have shots from the edge of the area. But actually, the fact that in the majority of the game, aside from the goals, the fact that he put in that battling performance in midfield by doing his defensive and offensive work and basically just being a pain to the opposition, that was of course great to see as well. And the thing that also did impress me is that sometimes playing against your former club, it can seem to affect you, and sometimes you can make sort of reckless challenges, but the fact that he made a number of well-timed challenges, against his former teammates, to get the ball back and win the ball back, and like I said, using his physicality, that when he's got the ball back, to put the ball forward and start us up on the attack. The fact that he was able to do that fairly well and fairly effective as well, because he won the vast majority of these challenges. The fact that he was able to do that was of course really good as well. Now, much like what has been sort of a theme of quite a lot of our players this season, in the fact that they sort of have, you basically go missing in some halves of the games, and that certainly was the case for Kouyaté here. Now, obviously, as a whole, I do think Palace played significantly better in the first half, and whether that's because we got the early lead, or whether it's just the fact that West Ham weren't necessarily that great. They weren't terrible in that first half, but we slightly edged it in the fact that we had the goal, we had the advantage. But in the second half, where West Ham started to get in the game and eventually got the goals, Kouyaté did seem to go missing, and that's one of the reasons I can't necessarily give him a 7 for his performance, in the fact that he didn't really continue his first half performance into the second. Because I do think, like I've said already, in terms of the goals we conceded, if Kouyaté had continued to put in challenges and just put in that battling performance by making it difficult for the opposition, I'm certainly sure that at least one of them, either the first or the third goal, I'm sure either one of them could have been prevented if someone in midfield would have been there just to basically just either tackle or just block the shot to stop the players having shots from the edge of the area. But like I said already, it wasn't necessarily a bad performance from Kouyaté, and when you compare his performance to that of the defenders, then of course you're going to look at it and go, that's significantly better. So I do think overall, for Cheku Kouyaté playing against his former club, I do think a 6 overall is a fair result. When you consider it was a very battling performance from him, running up and down the field, using his physicality for both his defensive and offensive work, and the fact that he also put in a number of very good challenges as well was obviously great to see. But of course, the sort of negative side to that is the fact that he obviously went missing in the second half. But overall, like what I said with a few players already, Kouyaté's been quite a consistent player whilst he's been playing for us this season. And, with the important games coming up, especially the Leicester game at the weekend, we really need our players to step up and get back to their previous levels, because that is a really important game. And I certainly do think that Kouyaté, he's got that character to do that. But it is obviously, you can have the character, but we obviously need him to do that. Because, if he plays to his best of his ability, then that would be great against Leicester. But if he has another performance like this, where he goes missing for parts of the game, then of course it might not be the greatest performance we might see at the weekend. So hopefully Kouyaté can improve. But once again, I do think a 6 is a fair reflection of what was a relatively average, but not necessarily terrible performance from him. So I'm going to move on now to the captain, Luka Milivojevic, who I am going to give a 5 overall. Now, in terms of his performance, there's sort of negatives and pluses about it, and I do think we need to sort of have a fair discussion about both of them. Now, in terms of the booking he got quite early on in the game for pushing over Hernandez, that was obviously taking one for the team, as the phrase goes. And, you know, I've criticised him, especially against Everton earlier on in the season, that he wasn't making these challenges like he used to do last season. He wasn't making sure that if a player was on the edge of the area, he'd do all he could to stop them. But it was great to see him here against West Ham, you know, stopping Hernandez in his tracks and basically stopping a chance for West Ham. Now, yes, that's great in the fact that he's shown he's got that grit and determination to stop the opposition, but the negative side to that is the fact that he got booked. And I do think he's now at 5 bookings, so he might miss. I'm not sure if it's entirely true, but I think he's at 5 bookings, so he'll miss the Leicester game. And even if that is the case, then I do think it gives him time just to get back to his old self, get his fitness back up for the game after that, which I believe is Man City. But going back to this game here, you know, the fact that he took one for the team was great to see, but obviously it isn't great that he got booked for it. So of course the plus of that is the fact that he's now, unlike at the beginning of the season, he's now putting his body in the line, making these challenges to stop the opposition. Yes, that's great, but when you do give away silly free kicks and get booked, and the fact that he obviously had to be quite careful throughout the rest of the game not to get another booking, that of course seemed to affect him going forward. And I suppose you could sort of link it back to Chiati's performance in the fact that Luka was much the same, in the fact that he played relatively well in the first half, but because he was on that tightrope, because of that yellow card and the risk of getting a second, it obviously meant he couldn't be sort of as combative as he was in the first, as he you know, in that second half. But overall, I do think the fact that, you know, he'd done that, and the fact that he's improved on that, and the fact that he's now putting his body on the line and basically doing all he can, taking one for the team to stop the opposition, that was great to see. And the fact that he combined that with the fact that he took a fantastic free kick in injury time, which smashed the crossbar, you know, it was going into the top right corner. The fact that he combined, you know, his good defensive work with the fact that he was fairly effective in terms of that free kick being as good as it was, that was of course great to see. Now, in terms of the free kick itself, you know, it was about 30 yards out, and the fact that it would have been the perfect free kick if it had been a few inches under. It would have gone top corner, keeper was beaten, would have been one of our goals of the season. And, you know, I sort of compare it, I suppose, to Mile Jedinak's free kick against Liverpool all them seasons ago, in the fact that he got the dip was perfect, the direction was perfect, and the fact that the position of the ball, if it had been a few inches lower, then it would have been absolutely perfect. It would have gone into the top corner. So even though we were quite unlucky in that respect, it crashed up, it sort of hit the crossbar. That really was just a reflection of our game overall, and certainly our season overall, in the fact that we have really good chances, but we don't necessarily take them. Now, I'm not obviously blaming him for missing that free kick chance, but the fact that we went on to lose the game because we missed a few chances, and the fact that that would have been 2-0, probably would have killed the game off, and maybe the second half would have been different, then, you know, begs the question of what could have happened if it would have gone in. But it's nice to see him actually, A, taking free kicks, because when he first joined we didn't necessarily see it, but B, the fact that they're actually quite, most often, or more often than not, they're actually on target, so eventually one of them's going to go in, like the one against Bournemouth. And, you know, he was very unlucky here, and I can't really highlight it enough. But like I've said, obviously it's unlucky that it didn't go in, and if it did go in, it probably would have changed the complexion of the game, you know, being 2-0 up at half-time. So overall, can't really blame him for that, but once again, missed opportunity there. And the fact that he combined that with, you know, taking one for the team in that first half was obviously great to see. Now, like I said with Cheku Chiati, the fact that he went missing in the second half, that was much the same with Luka here. Now, that's not to say he was necessarily terrible in the game, but just the fact that he wasn't as effective. You know, we didn't see any more chances where he would step up for the free kick and actually test the goalkeeper. There weren't any chances where he had spread the ball forward, and there also weren't many sort of chances where he was very combative in midfield and actually got a challenge in and drove forward. So the fact that that sort of lacked in that second period, and maybe that's because he had to be careful because he was on yellow card, but wherever it was, he wasn't obviously that great in the second half. But overall, Luka Milivojevic, the captain, you know, I do necessarily think a 5 is a fair reflection. You know, I do think the fact that he took one for the team, even though he got booked for it, the fact that he made a tackle and took one for the team, whilst also taking a free kick, which he was quite unlucky didn't go in, that was obviously great to see, and I do think he obviously deserves a 5 for that. But of course, the negatives of his performance, and probably one of the reasons which limits him to a 5 as opposed to a 6, is just the fact that he went missing slightly in the second half, as well as the fact that he picked up a booking quite early on. So I do think overall, Luka Milivojevic, a 5 is a fair reflection. And like what I've said with a few players, and I'm going to keep repeating it, we've got a really important game against Leicester coming up, so we really need our players to get back to their old selves. And certainly Luka, if he can get back to his best levels, then hopefully he'll be really effective in that game at the weekend. So I'm now going to move on to the final player in the midfield, and that is of course Max Meyer, who I'm going to give a 6 overall. Now, something which I've mentioned quite a lot in this podcast, and I do apologise if I'm being quite repetitive, but Max Meyer was one of these players who once again had a good performance in the fact that in parts of the game he was quite effective, but then in others he was sort of a passenger, let's say, in the game, and he wasn't quite effective. And certainly I wouldn't necessarily use the phrase a game of two halves, but because I think he was quite effective in some parts of the first and some parts of the second. But the fact that he went missing in certain parts of each half, that was of course quite disappointing, and that sort of limited his performance to the 6 I've given him. But in terms of the first half, in comparison to his midfield partners, I do think in the first half he was a passenger and he was very ineffective in the game. And I've seen a few people on Twitter say they were surprised that he was even playing, because that was how much they didn't notice him. And I certainly can agree with that, in the fact that he was quite ineffective in that first half. And that's obviously the complete opposite to people like Luka and Chiarte, in the fact that they were fairly sort of they were basically passengers in that second half and really were ineffective in that half. So the fact that Meyer was a passenger in the first half wasn't great, but the fact that in the second half, when we were obviously 3-1 down, the fact that he was one of our most attacking players, much like what MacArthur was, in the fact that he was trying to get forward and trying to create chances for us to get back into the game, the fact that he was getting more involved in the second half in comparison to that sort of passenger performance in the first half, that was of course great to see. And in terms of sort of a phrase to just sort of describe his game, is the fact that he just completely passed him by. The fact that the game went by, we didn't really see much from him, other than obviously in the second half where he was quite involved quite a lot. Now, one of the main reasons I've given him a 6 as opposed to a 5 I've given to other midfielders is the fact that he was completely better after the break. Now, I talked about him being a passenger in the first half, and that's probably worthy of a 5. And certainly if you look at someone like Luka, for example, I do think he had a sort of similar performance, Max, to Luka in the first half. But in the second half, the fact that he was much, much better, and the fact that he obviously delivered that superb cross for Slup to obviously head home our second goal to make it 3-2. The fact that he was obviously involved in that and actually got the assist, that was of course great to see. Now, obviously it's disappointing that he obviously couldn't patch together a game of both halves where he was good in both the first and second, but the fact that he was obviously more effective when we were trying to get something from the game in the second half was really great. But it just does beg the question that if he had done so well offensively as he did in that second half in the first half, then maybe when we were 1-0 up we could have pushed on, maybe got it to 2-0, and maybe the game would have been different. But rather than sort of reminiscing of what could have happened, we could look at what happened and go, Max Meyer, yes, he was effective in that second half, and the fact that he delivered that superb cross for Slup to score his second goal of the season, yes, that was great. But obviously, ultimately, it was disappointing overall, his performance, and that's why I've given him a 6. Now, the final real sort of point I want to talk about is the fact that he obviously got taken off towards the end of the game, and obviously, I can't remember whether it was IU. We brought on Punchin for him. My mistake. Obviously, just checking my notes there. So of course, Punchin came on for Meyer towards the end of the game, and that was a move that really did surprise me, because literally moments before, Max Meyer had produced an absolutely fantastic assist for Slup to obviously head home. I think it was from a corner, so that was obviously great. And the fact that you're bringing on someone like Jason Punchin, no disrespect to him, but he's obviously not the same as he used to be. So rather than bringing on someone like him just to see out the game, because it was obviously at that point quite inevitable that we were going to lose, rather than doing that, keep Meyer on, because he had shown moments before that he can obviously create chances for his teammates to score. But rather than doing that, we obviously taken him on. Yes, we brought on fresh legs in Punchin, but he hasn't quite got that attacking threat that Meyer has, and that certainly sort of did seem to harm our play going forward for the rest of the game. Because if you look back at our chances, we didn't really have any real chances to get back into the game when it was 3-2, mainly because we didn't have that attacking threat, and that's certainly what Meyer was, and obviously bringing him off didn't really help. But overall, I do think Max Meyer, it was a performance certainly of a game of two halves, in the fact that his first half he was a passenger, fairly ineffective, but the fact that he came out second half and improved so much more, whilst also providing that fantastic assist for Jeffrey Slup to score from, obviously to make it 3-2, that was of course great to see. So Max Meyer here, slightly disappointing performance, but the fact that he was still involved defensively was of course great to see. So now I'm going to move on to the first of our two attacking players, and that is of course Andros Townsend, who I'm going to give a 7 overall. Now, much like what I've been saying, throughout the whole podcast, and the fact that players have had sort of games of two halves, I do think Townsend sort of fits into that category once again, and that's mainly because his first half performance was really great, and certainly I maybe could have given him an 8 overall, but obviously his second half performance was slightly not necessarily slightly worse, but it wasn't as effective as his first half performance was. So I do think overall, I do think the 7 sort of is a fair reflection of the fact that his first half was probably an 8, and maybe his second half was a 6 overall. Now, one of the main reasons I was really impressed with his performance, and one of the reasons I've given him a 7, is just the fact that he was very lively in the game. Now, obviously, Andros Townsend, we know he's got loads of energy, and he's always, given lots of effort to the team, and that's something we've come to expect from him. But in this game here against West Ham in particular, it was quite obvious that he was very lively, he had lots of energy, and obviously he was always looking, and always was actively looking to get at West Ham. Now, one of the other things that really did impress me is that even though he was playing up top, which once again isn't his correct position, and obviously he's not as effective there, but the fact that he was always looking to get on the ball, and he was always looking to drift out wide, whether that be on the left or right flank. The fact that he was looking to get on the ball whilst also getting in positions as well where he could get onto the end of chances as well, that was of course great to see as well. Now, I suppose the negative from that is that even though he got into these good positions by popping up on both flanks, he didn't necessarily have that end product both in his shooting and both in his passing for his teammates. But the fact that he actually found himself in that situation, even though it was a disappointing team performance, the fact that he actually showed that intent going forward by looking to get on the ball and looking to, get into positions to do that, that was of course great to see as well. Now, I suppose another negative of his performance is the fact that he drew quite a number of clumsy fouls, and obviously that's one of the other reasons why I can't give him an 8 overall for his performance, and that's just because, yes, he was so lively and he was using it to good effect in some aspects of his game, but then there were other aspects in his game where he was obviously quite lively, which is great, but obviously that led to him giving away a number of silly and clumsy fouls as well. So I suppose you've got to look at both sides and actually go, yes, he used his sort of physicality and his sort of energy for good use, but also a bad use as well. Now, going on to the second half, I do want to sort of say that even though I said that his second half was it was a game of 2 halves and his second half wasn't that great, I still think he was a constant threat after half time. Now, one of the main reasons for that is just because he was putting in a number of crosses into the right areas for his teammates, but they didn't gamble onto them. So whereas in his first half he was very lively, always looking to get on the ball and popping up on the ball, the second half was more sort of a half where he was looking to get the ball out wide and actually create chances for his teammates. So as opposed to him being the focal point of the attack, he was actually looking to come provide. Now, that obviously I don't have a problem with that, but when you were so good and so effective going forward in that first half, then maybe that would have been nicer for him. That is to sort of add to the fact that he was a constant threat. So if he had just added that sort of end product, whilst also just putting more and more balls into the box, which his teammates could gamble on, that of course would have been great to see. Now, going back to the chances, yes, he was putting a number of crosses into the box, but one of the main reasons they didn't come to anything is just because of his teammates didn't gamble on it. So whilst we could obviously criticise Townsend for not putting in enough crosses, the ones that he did put into the box, the fact that his teammates didn't gamble on it, that is the thing that's really is disappointing overall. But I do think a 7 overall is a fair reflection, when you consider in that first half he was very lively, always looking to get involved, always looking to get the ball to his feet, whilst also, playing on both flanks. Yes, he obviously made a number of silly fouls here and there, but I do think the fact that that was only a small part, and only sort of a small negative of his game, really is a positive. And the fact that he obviously combined his first half performance with the fact that he was just a constant threat in the second half, looking to create for his teammates, that was of course great to see. So I do think Andros Townsend, I do think a 7 is a fair result. So now I'm going to move on to the final player in our starting 11, and that is of course Wilfried Zaha, who I'm going to give it a 6 overall. Now, much like what I've been saying with quite a lot of players, and it's certainly something I've repeated quite a lot, it's just the fact that certain players had a game of 2 halves, and I do think that was the case with Wilfried Zaha's performance here. Now, obviously I talked about Townsend and the fact that he was much better in the first half, and obviously the second half he was less so. And for Zaha, it was the complete opposite in the fact that in the second half, wasn't really much to talk about because he wasn't really involved as he would have liked to, and that's mainly because just Andros Townsend was so much better than him, and when you play a 4-4-2, if one of the strikers is playing better than the other, then one of them's not really going to be involved, and certainly that was the case in the first half. But obviously, on the contrary, the second half was a lot better, and I do think that one of the main reasons for that, and one of the reasons why Zaha played so much better in that second half, is just the fact that he done what Townsend done in that first half, and basically demanded the ball, wanted to get involved, and looked to get the ball to feet. So the fact that he was able to do that, whilst also when he got the ball to feet, by just being that constant threat like he always is to the opposition by running at them, that was of course a good thing to see. Now, one of the reasons he wasn't necessarily that effective is mainly because the West Ham just defended so well, and one of the main reasons for that is just because West Ham basically were doubling up on him, and basically just whenever he got the ball, got it off him really easily, and that's one of the reasons why he wasn't necessarily that effective. But like what I said with Townsend, the fact that they both had the energy up top and they were both looking to create chances, that was of course great to see. But of course with Zaha, it's quite worrying in the fact that, yes, he's obviously our star man, he's been playing relatively well this season, but considering the standards he set, last season, this is sort of an under par season. And, go back to the 6 I've given him. One of the main reasons for that is because he was very disappointing performance in the fact that we didn't see what we usually see from him, which is of course the high standard that he normally sets. But overall, Wilfried Zaha here, didn't necessarily get involved as much as he would have liked in the first half, and that's mainly because Andros Townsend was just so much better than him. But actually in the second half, the fact that he actually demanded the ball more, carried the ball forward a lot more, the fact that that seemed to improve his performance was great to see. But when you consider, the games we've got going forward, Leicester game, which obviously he can't play in because he got a yellow card. But when you consider, we've got games like this going forward, we need all of our star players, especially the defence as well, who seem to sort of drop a little bit recently. We really need all of our best players to get back to the standard that we obviously expect from them. And Zaha's one of these players who, yes, he's been plodding along, being, not necessarily being terrible, but just being fairly average this season. But we need him to really sparkle in the games coming up, because, we've got some important games coming up, and obviously he's our star man, so we really need him to shine up in the next few games. But overall, do you think a 6 is a fair reflection of his performance when you consider he was obviously quite effective in that second half? And that's probably one of the reasons more so why I've given him a 6, in the fact that his first half was probably worth a 5, second half probably a 7, so I do think overall a 6 is a fair result. And like I said, obviously it's quite disappointing for him to get his 5th yellow of the season at the weekend for a silly foul, which of course means he will miss the game against Leicester at the weekend. So I'm going to move on now to the subs. Obviously Jeffrey Schlupp, Jordan Ayew and Jason Puncheon. Now Jordan Ayew and Jason Puncheon, I'm not really going to give them ratings overall, mainly because they didn't really offer too much in the game and they didn't really do too much of note, but also because they weren't really given that much time to make an impact. You look at Jordan Ayew, he was brought on once West Ham were 3-1 up, so the damage had already been done. And of course Jason Puncheon brought on quite late in the game, so not really enough time to make an impact there. But on the other hand, Jeffrey Schlupp, obviously I've criticised him quite a lot this season because he hasn't necessarily been that great. And I think the only bit of praise I've given him this season was, of course, against Fulham, where he scored. And, against Burnley, obviously last week, where I thought he was very effective in the fact that when he came off the bench, he made a difference in the fact that not only did he bring fresh legs, but also he obviously was looking to get the ball into the box. Now, even though he wasn't necessarily that great in this game here in terms of, helping us to get back into the game, win the game, the fact that he obviously scored a goal from an excellent header from obviously a Max Meyer corner, the fact that he was able to do that and able to contribute to the game, and the fact that he got a goal to make it 3-2, that was of course great to see. But like I've said, when you bring on subs in the 53rd minute, even when he scored with 50 minutes to go, because of that and because you've left it so late in the game and because the damage had already been done, you can't really expect too much from the subs overall. Now, obviously, I talked about Van Aanholt going off with a shoulder injury, so this wasn't necessarily a sub Roy Hodgson probably was expecting to make, and I certainly do think Jeffrey Schlupp would have came on, but the fact that it was a forced substitution maybe would have worked into our hands, albeit we lost one of our best defenders in Van Aanholt, and maybe that could have been a reason why we conceded the goals we did. But actually, Jeffrey Schlupp still came on, and even though he wasn't necessarily the greatest, the fact that he popped up at the right moment to, score, which was, with excellent header to make it 3-2, that was of course great to see. But like I've said, with all 3 substitutions, Jeffrey Schlupp coming on for Van Aanholt, obviously Jordan Ayew coming on for MacArthur, and Jason Puncheon coming on for Meyer, they didn't really have too much time to make an impact, and that's mainly because West Ham had already done the damage already. But overall, Jeffrey Schlupp a 6, and no ratings for the other 2 substitutes in Ayew and Puncheon. So I'm just going to give you sort of an overall summary of the game, just to sort of give you my overriding thoughts overall. And even though this has been a cliche which I've used quite a lot this season, but yes, we keep losing games and, we're on a really bad run of form at the moment. But the fact that we're not necessarily playing terrible, this game was far from our best. But the fact that we're still not playing terribly, we're just making mistakes or not, that's the really disappointing thing for me. Because we keep, hitting teams quite effectively on the break, but we're obviously giving the ball away, or we're not necessarily being that clinical. So we've got glimpses where we're not playing that great, but the fact that we're sort of combining that sort of lack of quality in front of goal with the fact that we're not necessarily playing that great was of course a really disappointing thing. Now obviously in addition to that, the fact that we've now combined our lack of sort of quality up front with the fact that our defensive solidity has sort of gone downhill, that is of course really quite disappointing as well. And just going back to the offensive play, the fact that we've now, yes, we're creating loads of chances, but the fact that most of them are quite limited, in the fact that positionally it's really difficult to get on the end of them, and the opposition are able to deal with them really well, but also the fact that they're fairly predictable as well, our balls into the box and our attacks. That is of course another disappointing thing. So not only is our sort of defensive work going sort of sub par as well and substandard, but also our offensive work seems to not be getting any better as well. And of course, if you can't score goals whilst also not keeping them out, that's obviously a bad recipe and not really going to help us really well. And you look back at the games we've played against the top 6 teams recently, we played really well against them but still lost them. And obviously now we're getting to teams like West Ham, like Brighton, where ultimately our defence should be solid, but now we've sort of reverted back to our old ways, and that sort of defensive solidity seems to have disappeared. But hopefully going forward, West Ham are probably one of the better sides and more dangerous sides we've played recently, so hopefully in the next few games or so we can sort of get back that quality in front of goal, but also we can obviously get our basically get our defending back to the standard it was at the beginning of the season, because it just seems to have dropped slightly recently. Now, of course, the goals they scored were sort of 3 cracking goals. Obviously, the first and third, they were obviously great strikes, and I talked about already in the fact that the midfield didn't necessarily close the players down quick enough. And obviously, the other one was a very poacher sort of like goal, and that was for West Ham's second goal. And although I said Hennessy made the mistake there with the free kick, it's still quite a cracking goal in the fact that Hernandez was in the right place at the right time and was still able to put it past Hennessy. So even though that's quite a sloppy goal to concede, if you put that alongside the other ones, I think you could say West Ham obviously deserved the win, but they actually scored 3 relatively good draws and goals. And like I said, and I suppose this going back to the Brighton game, the fact that the opposition just punished us with their sort of good finishing and just their ruthlessness just to take their chances, that's one of the reasons why we lose these games, because we're not ruthless in front of goal, and we have loads of chances, which is great, but we don't finish them off. But then the opposition do the complete opposite, where the fact that they don't necessarily have loads of chances, but they take their chances really well, and that's something we maybe need to learn from, because obviously it's quite disappointing, especially at the moment where, yes, we're playing relatively well in spells, and our defensive's gone downhill. It's not necessarily absolutely diabolical, but of course we need to improve that going forward. Now, of course, we've been quite unfortunate at times. We hit the crossbar in this game here from a Luka free kick, and we've missed a few chances, but actually one of the reasons for that is just for that fact that we're not taking our chances. So we shouldn't necessarily find ourselves in a position where we can just go, yes, we're unlucky, we had loads of chances but missed them, but now we need to actually take these chances because our luck is sort of ending now, and obviously we're starting to show that actually our lack of clinical finishing seems to be coming back to haunt us at the moment. And obviously this is sort of a perfect storm, or sort of a perfect start to a bad storm, in the fact that once your defence goes down and obviously we can't score chances, once both your defensive and offensive work goes downhill, that's sort of going into a really bad position. So hopefully we need to fix that into the games coming up. Now, really for me, obviously I don't really want to talk too much more about the game. It was a good performance in spells, but ultimately West Ham deserved to win because they just outplayed us. They scored great goals and were clinical, and once again our defence was quite lacklustre, and we obviously didn't take our chances. But overall, the thing that's most worrying at all for me is not necessarily the fact that our defences just totally seem to have gone downhill, or the fact that we're still missing chances in front of goal. For me, it's the reaction from the players. The fact that the players are reacting badly, and the fact that they're looking frustrated. Now, of course, if you've got frustrated players, that's going to affect them because they're obviously going to perform bad, and that's why our defence and our attack has gone down so low. But people like Wilfried Zaha and Tompkins, the fact that they're not playing as well as they have done it previously is obviously quite disappointing, because I guarantee you, against West Ham here, if Wilf had been on his day, we maybe could have had, he probably could have been very effective in that first half, and maybe we would have ended up getting something from the game. And of course, Tompkins, if he had been on his top of his game, maybe we wouldn't have conceded the goals we did. So we've got 2 players here who are really important to us, but they haven't necessarily been playing that great in this game here. But also we've got players here who are looking frustrated. So obviously you can understand players not playing well, but the fact that they combine that with the fact they get, they look frustrated. Tompkins getting a yellow card as well as Wilf getting another yellow card. So these 2 players who are really important for us, they've obviously took their frustration off by obviously getting booked. Wilf for a silly foul, and obviously Tompkins for something which happened in the changing room after the game. Or he was talking to the referee and he obviously got booked for that. So of course, players sort of are reacting badly to the fact that we're not playing that, or we're not getting the results, and that seems to be affecting our play, because you look back at the games we've played against the top 6 this season. We've played well, but even though we didn't get results, we still carried on and we're still able to put in good performances. But now it seems to be got to a point where rather than players reacting really well to good performances, they just seem to be reacting really badly to these bad performances, and that's obviously something we need to improve, because we can't have our players losing their heads, because basically that's going to be a downward spiral, because we can't always play that well each game, so you can't be disappointed if you lose. So what we need to do now is get that sort of right mixture between playing well, getting results, because I'm sure that's something that will obviously help the players to be less frustrated. But like I've said already, the fact that the players are reacting badly isn't great, and it really starting to feel like some sort of curse in the fact that we've been playing well, but now it seems to just be going downhill. And like I've said, it's sort of a spiral. It seems to be getting worse and worse and worse. So hopefully, especially starting against Leicester at the weekend, we can come back to our old selves in the fact that we defend well and we can counter-attack well. And like I said, all it needs is just us to go back to basics and defend well, whilst also just taking our chances in front of goal. And if we do that, then we'll be fine this season. But obviously, one of the reasons our performances recently have been disappointing is because we haven't done that. But overall, obviously, not an awful performance from us, but not one of the best. And like I've said already, defensive frailties, giving away these sloppy goals, especially sort of in front of the defence as well. The midfield not doing their job, and of course, our sort of lack of our lack of a clinical edge going forward as well. That seems to be hurting us going forward. So really, for me at the moment, it seems like, what is the point of watching Palace? Because even when we perform well, we don't get results, and then when we don't perform well, we don't get results because we just seem to make stupid mistakes. So overall, really disappointing performance once again against West Ham. But we've got to say, West Ham did deserve the win. They're a good, very dangerous side on counter-attack, and obviously it was disappointing for us to lose the game. But ultimately, that's what you get when you play bad. So hopefully, the game at the weekend against Leicester, we can obviously improve on this and just go back to basic, go back to how we were before, where we were very solid defensively. And even if we are not going to, we're going to be not very clinical in front of goal again, at least just get that defence right and just do an Allardyce and just hope for a 0-0 draw. Keep, your priority is a clean sheet, and if we start from that basis, then hopefully results will come. But overall, another disappointing performance where obviously we made both stupid mistakes, both in defence and obviously in midfield as well. So now I'm going to move on to my Man of the Match award, but before I do that and give you my Man of the Match, I thought the biggest influence in the game, I'm now going to give you the 4 nominations I put forward for the award. Now, much what was sort of the same things as I was talking about sort of the Brighton game midweek, in the fact that it was a fairly disappointing performance, and particularly for me it was quite difficult to pick out anyone who really starred for me. I do certainly think this was sort of a similar story here, in the fact that yes, we played well for parts of the game, but basically West Ham were just better than us on the day, and ultimately that seemed to affect our performance overall. But unlike the Brighton game, because we played better in spells and we actually played well, and the fact that we actually got a few goals from open play in this game obviously goes to show that it was a slightly better performance, let's say, than the Brighton one was. And certainly I do think that even though it's pretty difficult to give a Man of the Match award, because really it was another disappointing performance and I don't really think anyone deserves it, I do certainly think that there's 4 players who I've picked out who were better than the rest. They weren't excellent, but they were better than the rest, and I suppose you've got to give them a bit of recognition for that overall. So the 4 players I've gone with is James McArthur, Cheku Kouyaté, Max Meyer and Andros Townsend. Now in terms of James McArthur, obviously he scored our goal within 6 minutes of the game. Obviously a nice ball whipped into the box, Tompkins has headed it down, and obviously McArthur was able there just to prod it underneath the goalkeeper. Now obviously that's a great finish, and it's great, he scored the goal against Burnley within weeks ago, and I said maybe this is the turning point, maybe this is the thing that's going to kick-start his season. And the fact that he's now got 2 goals in 3 games, maybe that's a sign of things to come. But like I said, obviously the knockdown was good from Tompkins, but the fact that McArthur was composed to stick it underneath the goalkeeper was great. So ultimately, the fact that he got one of our only goals in the game, that was of course great to see. Obviously Slup got another goal, but our first goal, one of only 2 goals we scored. So of course James McArthur in that respect, that's why he's on there. And like I said, yes, the goal was good in terms of the composure, but I suppose the knockdown, and I suppose you could say the positioning as well. The fact that McArthur knew where to position himself to get on the end of that flick, that was obviously good as well. But actually, moving aside from his goal, I just think that generally in the midfield he done a very effective job, and without any fuss. And when you consider, West Ham were playing quite a lot better than us, the fact that he still got on with his job, done what he had to do without any fuss, really that's got to give a bit of credit for him. So MacArthur, the reason he's on my shortlist is for scoring our first goal, and obviously just for being pretty effective, albeit not great, but being effective in the midfield. Now Cheku Kouyaté, playing against his former club, much the same in terms of the performance of MacArthur and the fact that he'd done his work in the midfield very effectively, and I suppose the word to use was battling, because that's exactly what he'd done. He was obviously putting himself about a bit, making it difficult for the opponents, but like I've said, because West Ham were playing better, he wasn't necessarily as effective as he has been previously, but nevertheless, you know, slightly better than some of our other performances of other players in the side. And obviously, you know, even though it's against his old side, he was still putting in tackles, you know, showing that grit and determination to, you know, get the ball off the opposition, and the fact that he won a fair amount of them obviously goes to show how good they were. But obviously, like I've said, even though he was one of our better players, he still had his downside in the fact that in the second half he went missing. So the reason I've put him on the shortlist is because, much like MacArthur, I think he was relatively effective in his job. But like I've said, and I'm going to keep repeating this, but you know, he wasn't necessarily the greatest, but I still do think give him a bit of recognition for being better than the rest. In terms of Max Meyer, my third player, you know, I've put him in here because I do think, much like Kouyaté, he was, and suppose MacArthur to an extent, they were both, or all three of them were fairly effective in the game, but Meyer was sort of the complete opposite to Kouyaté in the fact that Meyer was a passenger in the first half, but actually in the second half he was much better. Got the assist for Slupp's goal, you know, great ball into the box, and obviously Slupp headed home. So not only was Max Meyer, even though his first half weren't great, you know, as was the whole team's first half weren't really great, but the fact that in the second half, when we were trying to push to get back into the game, the fact that he provided that fantastic assist for Slupp to head home, that was obviously great to see as well. So much like what I said with Kouyaté, even though Kouyaté went missing in the second half and Meyer went missing in the first half, I still think that, relatively looking at their performances as a whole, I do think they were relatively effective in their roles in the midfield. Obviously Kouyaté mainly for his defensive work, and obviously Meyer for the assist that he obviously gave to Jeffrey Slupp. Now my final player here, this was someone who I was debating whether or not to put him on here, but I'm going to give Andros Townsend a bit of credit, because I do think, much like MacArthur in the first half, I thought he was very lively. Always was, you know, looking to get on the ball, always popping up the flanks, down the middle, always trying to get involved. But obviously, I suppose, you know, much like all the players, there was still a few sort of silly and clumsy fouls. So like I've said, the whole team performance wasn't great, but you're looking at Townsend, he was obviously better than the rest, albeit not great, but still there was a few things that sort of really summed up why we had a bad team performance, in the fact that even though players were playing well, they still had little things about the performance. So Townsend's on my shortlist mainly because of how lively he was, and the fact that he was always getting involved, looking to get on the ball, and the fact that he just posed a constant threat to the opposition. That is great as well. So the fact that we weren't playing that great offensively in the game, the fact that we had at least one player trying up front, trying to get at the opposition, that was of course great to see. You know, something I've called upon him to do all season, put more crosses into the box. That's exactly what he did in this game. You know, we obviously couldn't necessarily play the ball out, and we couldn't sort of play nice football. We had to play sort of more Route 1 football because of how well West Ham were defending, and that basically meant that Andros Townsend had to go out wide, get the ball into the box. And ultimately that's great, and that's one of the reasons he's on the shortlist, in the fact that he's looking to create, but the fact that none of his teammates really gambled on it, none of them sort of really tried to get on the end of it, was really what was quite disappointing. And then once again, that goes back to the point in the fact that the team performance was disappointing, and one of the reasons for that is that when you've got someone like Andros Townsend creating chances, the fact they weren't really taking these chances and weren't gambling on trying to get in the end of balls, that's really what's disappointing for me. But obviously all of these players, even though they weren't necessarily all great, I do think they deserve a bit more credit, because like I've said, they were better than the rest. And I certainly do think MacArthur, Kouyaté and Meyer, for their work in midfield, deserve obviously a bit of credit. Obviously MacArthur for scoring the goal, Meyer for getting an assist, and obviously Kouyaté for doing his defensive work, and of course Andros Townsend just doing what he normally does, posing a threat to the opposition. That's the reason he's on my shortlist. But I suppose for me, even though it's pretty difficult considering the circumstances and the bad performance, it's quite difficult to pick someone, but I'm going to give it to James MacArthur. So congratulations, James. You don't get a trophy or certificate, but you do get my sincere congratulations on what was a good performance from you, and certainly one where you were better than the rest, and certainly do deserve the award. But like I've said, you know, it is pretty difficult to pick one when you consider how bad the performance was. But the main reason I'm going to give it to MacArthur, as opposed to, you know, the other three nominations I've put on here, is just the fact that he got our first goal. You know, good finish. You know, obviously the flick on was good, but the fact that he positioned himself well enough and timed his run to obviously get on the end of the ball, then tuck it under the goalkeeper. The fact that he had that, whilst also combining that with his fairly effective play in midfield. Of course, that's the main reason that I think he does deserve the award. But if you do have any different opinions to me, then of course do feel free to comment them below. And if you do have any questions for me, obviously also feel free to do that below as well. So now you've heard my match report, player rankings and my man of the match. That concludes this week's podcast. Now I've got interviews with Roy Hodgson and Jeffrey Slupp following the game.
Jeff, we started the game well and unfortunately didn't come away with anything from today's game.
Yeah, obviously it's another disappointing result, but especially when obviously we started the game well. Maka got the first goal and we actually looked quite comfortable. West Ham's never an easy place to come to play, but I thought we went in at half time, looking in good nick. But then it was obviously disappointing to come out the second half, and they got a goal, and then obviously another two quick fire ones, and then that seemed to have killed the game off a bit. But we got positives to take from the game, first half especially, and then obviously we got some things that we need to work on, but we'll work on that and be ready for the game against Leicester.
You didn't start the game, but you came on and slotted in at left back. You've been playing in midfield. How has it been back at part of that back four?
Yeah, I've been ready, when called upon to come in, whether it's at left midfield or left back, to come and help the team when I've needed to. I've had to do that off the bench in recent games, but I've been ready and waiting, and I've played at left back before. I played quite a bit last season, and I was ready, just to slot in there and do the same job that Patrick's been doing so well of recent.
It's not all negative. We scored 2 games away from home. We're back at Sellers Park next week, where we got a good result against Burnley. What do you think looking ahead to the game against Leicester?
Yeah, like I said, there's plenty of positives to take from the game still, even though it was a disappointing result, and we already know what we're capable of doing at home. We played Burnley last week at home. We got a great result, a great performance, and obviously with the fans behind us at home, everyone knows the atmosphere that they create, and hopefully they can be a 12th man like they've been so many times and help us win the game.
Roy, tough one to take after such a positive start.
Well, I don't think we played that well in the first half, quite honestly, so I don't think it was that positive a start. I thought the best part of our play actually came when we went 2 goals to 1 down. I thought that's when we played our best football, and the third goal there was a bit of a killer blow, because I think had we not conceded that one, even despite the disappointment of conceding 2, I think we could have got back into the game and come away from it with the result. At 3-1, whenever you concede 3 goals, home or away, it's a long road back. But I can't fault the players' desire and attempts to do that. And the defeat hurts me, but it hurts me even more that one of the things that we were desperate not to happen today, yellow cards to Zaha, Tompkins or Luca, 2 of them managed to get yellow cards and rule themselves out of next week's game, which is going to be an important one for us, playing at home against Leicester. And again, losing 2 players of that quality is not going to be easy for us.
And as you say, at 3-1 down, Schlappy came on and grabbed the goal and got us back in the game. We had moments where we could have drawn level. Yeah, we did. I mean, but the fact is they had something to cling on to, just like in the first half we had something to cling on to at 1-0. And at this level of football, you expect teams to hold on to that. And we did what we could, I thought. But of course, the longer the game goes, you get into the last 5 and 10 minutes. Every time the ball goes for a throw in, the game gets slowed down, or it gets played up into your half, and people sort of hang on to the ball and get themselves a throw in, and you just see the time being eaten away. When we actually could get the ball down and play in that period of time, I thought we did quite well. But those minutes seem to be few and far between. And you touched upon it, Zaha picked up a yellow out on the pitch, and Tompkins has always got a yellow, ruling themselves out for next week. How does that affect the preparation? Well, it rules of 2 of our most important players, I think. 2 players who've been doing exceptionally well. The centre-back pairing of Tompkins and Mamadou Sakho has been excellent throughout the season. Now that's got to change. And of course Zaha is a player who is a match winner type. He's a player that we rely heavily upon to take the game to the opposition and ask questions of them. And now in an important home game, we won't have him because he got booked in the 93rd minute. And back at Selhurst next week, last time we played there, really good performance, so it's good to get back in front of the fans and pick up where we left off. Well, we hope so. I mean, the fans, they support us home and away here again today. There was a very vocal and a very positive support from the fans, so we can never complain about that. We can only hope now that they'll
they'll raise the roof as they did against Burnley, and we'll do our level best to try and give them something to cheer about.
So there you have it. Now you've heard what Roy Hodgson and Jeffrey Slupp had to say after the game. That concludes this week's podcast for the game against West Ham. But make sure to comment next week for my post-match review of the game against Leicester. So thanks for listening, and remember to up the Palace.